Hello, and welcome to week 2, where we'll be talking about public service. So this week focuses on providing you with a high-level background of public service. Now this topic will delve a little bit further into public service motivation, or PSM, and also the values, policies, and structures that help to define public service and the related system of civil service, all of which influence public sector HR management, approaches, and decision-making. So let's first start with an overall definition of public service and a public servant. So the technical definition of a public service could be considered as this. Public service is goods or services created, managed, and implemented under the auspices of a legally public organization via the actions of an employee working in that organization. However, a more philosophical definition of a public servant is one whose interest and subsequent work, whether through formal employment, volunteering, or civic engagement, benefits the public interest or the greater good. So here we have a table that highlights the evolution of public administration from traditional public administration approaches to new public management to where we are now with the new public service. For those of you who are going to be taking the comp exam for the MPA program, I highly advise that you take a look at this publication, which is called the Public Value Governance, Moving Beyond Traditional Public Administration and the New Public Management, because it gives a very concise but also comprehensive view of how public administration has evolved over time along several key dimensions. So let's highlight a few of those key dimensions and the connection with HR management. So let's take a look at perhaps the first dimension that Bryson et al. Take a look at here, which is what are the concerns of traditional public management, as well as a new public service. So at the beginning, when traditional public administration first came about, the more traditional approach really focused on industrialization, urbanization, the rise of the modern corporation, specialization, faith in science, belief in progress, concern over major market failures, experience with the Great Depression and World War II, and high trust in government. Now that has since evolved to where with new public management, the concern was concern with government failures, distrust of big government, belief in the efficacy and efficiency of markets and rationality, and devolution. And now, in the context of new public service, the greater concern is with market, government, nonprofit, and civic failures, concern with so-called wicked problems, deepening inequality, hollowed out or thin state, downsized citizenship, networked and collaborative governance, advanced information and communication technologies. So essentially what this first, I would say, row highlights is the context in which public administration actually operated in based on these different types or different approaches to public administration. Now, from an intellectual perspective, what were some of the underpinnings of each of these approaches? So for traditional public administration, the theoretical concerns or underpinning really focused on political theory, scientific management, and a little bit of social science and also pragmatism. And then it evolved to new public management, where a strong intellectual emphasis was in using economic theory as well as sophisticated positivist science. And then in new public service, the intellectual underpinning is more of an emphasis on democratic theory, public and nonprofit management theory, as well as diverse approaches to knowing. And then when we look at this other dimension here, which is really important for HR, what were the viewpoints of rationality and the model of human behavior for all three of these areas? And so from the traditional public administrative perspective, it was all about professionalism. It was all about the administrative man, and that administrative man was more so about being a technician and being neutral and being highly rational. And then that has since changed to where the public sector worker, public manager, is not just technical and economic with their rationality, but they're also self-interested, and the emphasis with new public management focused on the new public manager and employees being decision makers. So in the new public service, however, the viewpoint of the human or the model for human behavior includes not only rationality, but also being political themselves. So that means being open to influence, but also being able to influence through dialogue and deliberation. But there's also a little bit less interest in the self. So there's a little bit less interest in how the individual who is practicing public administration can benefit for themselves. And this is really important here. There's a belief in public spiritedness. Now, this is important because how the human being was viewed, on each of these kinds of dimensions of traditional public administration, new public management, and new public service can definitely dictate and has dictated how human resource management has been approached and how public sector workers have been managed, as well as the behavior of human leaders or people leaders in the public sector. So again, I highly advise that you take a look at all of these dimensions here and see how each one of these dimensions has varied over time, from traditional public administration to new public management to new public service, because that can tell you a lot and it can inform how you understand human leadership processes in public administration and public organizations. So let's take a little bit of a deeper dive here with some of these other kinds of dimensions when we're trying to understand new public service. So if we take a look at the role of the public manager, for instance, which is again very important when we're looking at HR practices in the context of new public service, the role of the manager is this: they play an active role in helping to create and guide networks of deliberation and delivery, and they help to maintain and enhance overall effectiveness, accountability, and capacity of systems. They tend to be, or expected to be, more responsive to elected officials and citizens and other stakeholders, and they also understand, and it's expected, that they'll use discretion, but there's also an understanding that their discretion does have some constraints to it, and we'll talk about that more in a minute. And then also the role of the public manager, or the public manager who is practicing or operating under this new public service dimension, really embodies and tries to practice democratic and constitutional values, and they have a broader approach to accountability. So let's take a look at public values, and this is from Jorgensen and Bozeman. And essentially, public values are these agreed upon, I would say, ways of being, ways of doing for improvement of society and maintenance of society. And so there's this kind of expectation on behalf of people in power, government, I would say public institutions, as well as constituents, in terms of how each party is going to behave. So now, as far as public values and the public values that people have of public service workers, is this. So generally speaking, the expectation is that public service workers are going to balance openness and secrecy. They're going to be responsive. They're going to listen to public opinion. They're going to balance advocacy and neutrality. They will know when to compromise, but also when to properly emphasize overall interests of various stakeholders. And they also know the balance between competitiveness and cooperation. And taking a further look at this, expectations of public service workers also tend to encapsulate them being accountable, them exercising professionalism, being honest, having moral standards, being ethical, actually operating within the law. And so they emphasize and they abide by the rule of law, but they are also interested in justice. Public service workers, based on the expectations that the public has of them, is also to act in an equitable way. They are expected to be reasonable, fair, and professional. They're expected to engage in dialogue and expected to actually appreciate and garner citizen involvement, and also to be very timely with their connections to citizens and constituents, as well as friendly. So this is really important because, again, this kind of defines more like the value system connected to public service and what it means for someone who is working in public service to operate. So another unique dimension to public service is the concept of street-level bureaucracy, which was coined by Michael Lipsky. So SLB describes a type of public service positions that mostly require direct interaction with the public, and examples of a street-level bureaucrat could include, but are not limited to, police officers, teachers, which is important for the case study, as well as social workers. So key features of a street-level bureaucrat that have human resource management implications include, but are not limited to, the following. managing employee discretion. So we saw this when we were looking at the dimensions of new public service and the role of the manager. So for the role of the manager, they are expected to, particularly in new public service, to really leverage the discretion that they may have. So for example, when we look at teachers, you can think of a street-level bureaucrat, as a teacher, maybe even a principal, where the teacher actually has some discretion in terms of how they manage their classroom. Now, from a principal's perspective, the role of the principal is to be able to manage that discretion that that teacher has in the classroom. However, and I'm going to just hop down to point 3 here, is that sometimes the discretion may conflict with expectations, either at the individual level or maybe even the policy level. And so, for example, even though a teacher may have some discretion with how they can run their classroom, sometimes what they may want to do in the classroom, what they feel is the moral, ethical, equitable, and just thing to do, may conflict with demands for, let's say, standardized testing, for instance, things of that nature. So I think we've heard of cases where you have these overarching state standardized testing laws that might limit what a teacher can do in the classroom. And so that's kind of the tension that in this particular example, the street-level bureaucracy or bureaucrat, that's an example of the tension that exists when it comes to actually allowing street-level bureaucrats or public service workers to have discretion, use it, but then also there are these conflicting expectations that may limit the discretion or the extent of the employee discretion. And that also relates to working conditions. And so at the for a street-level bureaucrat, they may experience working conditions that can make the implementation or policy implementation that they are striving for to be more difficult. So when we're taking a look at, let's say, teachers, for example, the physical conditions of a classroom may be suboptimal, and that can really limit them effectively implementing these overall policy aims of really good quality education. And then, of course, that can lead to burnout, stress, and that has these broader implications for employee satisfaction, commitment, and engagement. So inherent in public service, as you can tell by now, is the notion of public service motivation, or PSM, which you are already familiar with, but I do want to reiterate or highlight the original definition of PSM, which was coined by Wise and Perry, which is this. PSM is an individual's predisposition to respond to motives grounded primarily or uniquely in public institutions and organizations. So you can see here, public service is very much connected to PSM because essentially PSM is really about a person's predisposition to practice or to elevate public service. So since the initial introduction of PSM, it's undergone a lot of changes and scrutiny and development in the following ways. So again, this might be familiar to you, but I just want to reiterate and review here. So overall, the conceptualization of PSM has now included several dimensions, and that relates to a public service worker's level of compassion, their level of self-sacrifice, their civic duty, which is, in other words, their commitment to public interest, and their attraction to policy making and maybe even policy implementation. And then overall, PSM has evolved in terms of its measurements, and there has been quite a bit of effort to really test its validity as a construct and a measurement. And then, as with any kind of theory, there's always been debate about the validity of public service management as a legitimate theory. And as far as application and the use of PSM in a practical way, it's been used to enhance the public sector workforce in the following ways. So facilitating and understanding talent attraction, absenteeism, reward systems, retention, turnover, job performance, engagement, influence of culture and identity in the public sector, and job satisfaction. So here it's really important to note the difference between public service and civil service. So whereas public service focuses on the broader service of the public interest as well as related ethics and public values, civil service is a very distinct, formal, and codified system of workers, in other words, bureaucrats, who engage in public service as part of a government at the local, state, or federal level. So all civil servants are public servants, but not all public servants are civil servants. So for example, from a philosophical and values perspective, private sector employees can consider themselves public servants by way of how their work services the public interest. However, they would not be considered civil servants due to legal classification and codification. In other words, they don't work for a government agency. So early public sector HR practices actually have their roots in civil service, as it was essentially a system to organize professionals working for the government. So key features of civil service include the following: focus and development of the bureaucracy, being very bureaucratic, really focusing on the merits of workers, so it's a merit-based system, and related to that, it's very performance-centric, so looking at the work, looking at the tasks that are performed by civil servants, and it's very structured. So for instance, there are systems of classifications when it comes to job positions as well as salaries. So in the U.S., the Pendleton Act provided the impetus for establishing the first federal civil service, and there have been many reform calls and actions over several decades. So a number of direct and indirect civil service reforms have taken place over the years in the U.S. since the Pendleton Act, and they include but are not limited to the Hatch Act, the Civil Service Reform Act of 1978, emphasis on the decentralization and innovation in government, improved payment and reward system, emphasis on government performance, and overall new public management, which encompasses some of these previously mentioned directions and practices. So I do encourage you to dig further into some useful readings that can help you understand civil service and civil service reform. And those readings include The Federal Civil Service, The Demise of an Institution by James Thompson. He was actually one of my teachers in my Ph.D. program. And then also Civil Service Reform, Building a Government That Works by Kettle, Ingram, Sanders, and Horner. And then also, just for fun, I would encourage you to check out The Ancient Roots of Civil Service. And with this particular article, The Civil Service and the Ancient World, or of the Ancient World, it's just to emphasize here that civil service is not necessarily a strictly Western concept. You can actually trace the history of civil service back to ancient civilizations in Egypt, China, India, and Rome, to name a few. So let's take a slightly deeper dive into some of the civil service reforms in the U.S. So from the 1870s to 1880, and even before 1870s, I should say, there were patronage issues identified by political officials, or as political officials actually used spoil systems or approach for government job appointments. So in essence, what was happening is that in exchange for political support, political officials would actually promise people appointments or jobs in government if that political official actually won. So as a result of that, the U.S. Civil Service Commission was established as an advisory board by President Ulysses S. Grant to actually reform the spoil system. And then, unfortunately, in 1881, President James Garfield was assassinated by Charles J. Gutiot, who actually felt entitled to an appointment position in government. And so that led to the actual signing of the Pendleton Act in 1883, which initiated the establishment of a wider-scale, formal, structured, merit-based civil service force. So that meant job attainment based on exams, not the spoil system, as well as more codified job positions and classifications. And then after that, states started to adopt their own civil service systems after this, starting with New York and Massachusetts. And then in 1939, there's the signing of the Hatch Act, which limits the political activities of federal employees. And as you can imagine, that's pretty important if you want to maintain a more merit-based and non-spoil system approach to job appointments. Then, in 1978, you had the Civil Service Reform Act, which offered federal managers more flexibility to improve government operations, and that did include how they actually managed and led employees, but also the act reaffirmed the merit-based system and offered more protections to federal employees. It also led to the dissolution and decentralization of the U.S. Civil Service Commission, and that resulted in the establishment of the U.S. Office of Personnel Management, or OPM, the Merit Systems Protection Board, and the Federal Labor Relations Authority. So now we're going to delve a little bit more into the importance of actually understanding public service through understanding public service workers. And we have talked about this before, but I just want to reiterate this a little bit more. So understanding the perspectives, experiences, behaviors, and decision-making of public service workers can shed more lights on the dynamics of public service motivations, the realities of street-level bureaucrat dynamics, and additional factors that inform a unique approach to public service HR, and it can actually help you to better understand what public service is about, how it evolves over time, and its definition according to the people who actually work in public service. So one of the key ways to actually understand employee insights can be done through surveys. So here are a few examples of long-established public service worker surveys, and one of them is the Federal Viewpoint Survey from OPM. There are definitely state-level employee surveys, and there are a number of nonprofit employee surveys as well that are conducted at nonprofithr.com. So that is it for me. So I want you to, as always, make sure that you go through this checklist. Your discussion board assignments are going to be due on February 27th. And what is new here is you have your first assignment with the Rising Above program, and that's just going to entail a short survey for you to take this week. And more about that later, but I just want to reiterate this and to highlight this as something new to your checklist. So please make sure that you are connecting with others, you're doing and engaging in self-care, and you are elevating your productivity practices. And as always, if you need anything, please let me know.